I'm Andrea Grover. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and I'm in the College of Information Science and Technology in the Department of, this is a mouthful, Information Systems and Quantitative Analysis. I grew up in Michigan, right around the Lansing area, and I was always interested in science. I think it's just like inherent curiosity and then lots and lots of encouragement to pursue STEM. So it was kind of like the early era of really pushing for girls to see themselves as having career paths in science and math, and it worked. I was convinced. So when I went to undergrad, I went to Alma College, which is a small liberal arts college in mid-Michigan, approximately here. And I studied math, partly because I didn't like chemistry. And so I decided not to go through on pre-med. And math was just engaging in a way that it had never been in prior levels of school. It turns out I was really good at discrete math, and that's really not what's emphasized in most curricula. But I didn't do any research. It was, liberal arts college. There's not a lot of research emphasis. And I tried when my differential equations prof asked us to do these research projects, but it didn't really compute because research in math is basically like sitting and thinking really hard. Not exactly my style. So when I graduated, it was, I'm going to date myself, approximately the dot-com bust. And so a lot of the most available jobs for people who had like a math and computing related background had evaporated overnight after it being like a really good market. So because I basically needed a job right away and needed health benefits right away, I started working in nonprofits as an AmeriCorps Vista at Washington Literacy, which is an adult literacy agency. And it was really, really hard. I was a volunteer coordinator. I had no related experience. It was a real intro to the real world in a very intense way. And by the time I figured out what I was doing, my year of service was up, and for financial reasons, I couldn't continue because basically my stipend was less than a month's rent in Ann Arbor. And luckily I was splitting costs, but still. So I was lucky to move to another nonprofit literally down the hall in the same building. And I worked as an education associate, helping other nonprofits better manage themselves. And then kind of got bored of that after a year or so, and ended up moving to a performing arts company in Chelsea, Michigan, the Purple Rose Theater Company, where I was the office manager. And it was a good place to be, but again, after some time I got bored, and I had friends who were going to grad school at University of Michigan, which was walking distance from where I lived. And they kind of pointed out the School of Information's programs. And I looked at everything on the curriculum for human computer interaction. I was like, this sounds fascinating aside from this one course. And so I decided to go for it. And I was like, I'm saving the world to usability, right? But pretty quickly decided I would just go out of my mind if I had to watch people not click on the blue button all day, doing user testing. And I got really intrigued by research, and a doctoral student in the program really encouraged me to pursue that. And so I took some doc level courses and then switched my curriculum to be tailored for research prep. I actually had to petition to do a master's thesis. And I did that on hiring patterns in the information schools, just kind of looking at who brought what kind of disciplinary backgrounds to other institutions, where institutions hired from. Turns out this is a highly stable phenomenon across all fields, and how it goes, and prestige is what takes the day. So as I completed that degree, I was pretty well determined to continue with research. And so I applied to the iSchool at Syracuse University and did my PhD there. I started off looking at open source software because that was, what my supervisor was working on, but it's not the friendliest environment for people who don't fit a particular demographic. And I knew that, and I knew it would be an uphill battle if I chose to do a dissertation on that. And so while I was kind of debating this, right about that time, I stumbled across the term citizen science, and I was immediately intrigued. So my advisor said, look it up, spend a week reading about it, tell me if there's something there. And a week later I came back and said, this is really interesting. I don't know what the thing is that is important or relevant or worth studying, but there is something to this that we should give attention to. And so luckily I had the blessing to move forward, and not long after, like built ties with some folks at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is a real leader in the kind of citizen science space. And that just ended up being an amazing partnership. We got involved with Data One, the observation network for Earth, which was at the time kind of in its early phases of development. And so they really wanted a citizen science, community science component because they didn't want to ignore that as an important source of information about the Earth. So I really got in deep with a great group of citizen science professionals and researchers pretty early in my PhD, which meant I got pulled into all kinds of great collaborations because I was like the tech person they knew. And so when I finally graduated, my dissertation was on citizen science. The title is Crowdsourcing Scientific Work, a comparative study of technologies, processes, and outcomes in citizen science. So as you can tell, it's more of a social organizational science focus. And I was kind of lucky just to be on the leading edge of that. And I was had some of the first papers that really looked at citizen science from an organizational standpoint and from a technology standpoint. So when I graduated, I was like, this has been intense. I could use some recovery time before I look for a faculty job. So I started looking for a postdoc, and I ended up being a postdoc at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, co-appointed with University of New Mexico, which is very complicated in its own ways, but a lovely way to kind of build some ties and get to work in an amazing environment. I basically continued working on themes related to data in citizen science, a lot of stuff on data quality, because that's a fight that has been going on for a long time, justifying the goodness of the data and why it's worth using, and thinking about methods that we can use to better ensure a good experience for participants and all that kind of stuff. And so I got to work with a lot of great people that way. And essentially when I found my first tenure track job in 2014, I went to the University of Maryland to their iSchool. So I've studied in these interdisciplinary spaces basically the whole time, because when you're an interdisciplinary researcher, you basically have to master at least some portion of the literature for multiple disciplines. And they have wildly different conventions, wildly different expectations for publication venues. And if you don't have people who are deep in that space who can help guide you and mentor you, it's overwhelming. It's a lot to take on, especially when you're new to the space, but nobody's going to take that risk later in their career. So if you want to do interdisciplinary work, even though it's super hard and uphill, I would absolutely say tackle it when you're a student, because getting a really good foundation is kind of critical to the stuff you'll do later. The other thing from a career standpoint is that only certain types of institutions are going to have substantive programs in interdisciplinary spaces. So small liberal arts colleges, not a chance. Even smaller state schools, not so likely. Huge prestige schools like Harvard and MIT, also not so likely. They don't need to go along with the trend. So it really kind of narrows the space of where you can look for employment and have a realistic chance. Because the advice I always got, which was very solid advice, was no matter where you're applying, you're going to have to sell yourself as belonging there. And if you can't convince them that you belong there, that you can teach the things that they teach, that you understand their kind of publication space and their language, so to speak, then it's not going to work out. It meant that when I was applying for those faculty jobs, I applied to 5 jobs because there were 5 jobs that I could possibly actually get, and ended up at Maryland because I was like, let's see what kind of adventure I can have in the DC area. It turns out it's a great place to work if you want to have impact on federal agencies. So I've kind of worked on a real variety of things that are mostly related to those kind of data themes in citizen science the whole time. And I joke that I can get away with a wide variety of topics, partly because the space is just really underexplored from a social science and technology standpoint. And it's a really broad and diverse space to be working in. So I think my most impactful work was actually probably during my PhD. I wrote a paper in 2011 that got published at a conference that has open access proceedings, which I think is one of the reasons it took off really well. I happened to use really good keywords in the titles, from conservation to crowdsourcing. So that was like a second win in my favor. And I just like, it was the right timing for those things. And so it has gotten a lot more attention than I ever would have expected. So it's just basic typology paper, but unlike most of the citizen science typologies, which look at it from the perspective of who's doing which work, it was more like, how are the organizational and technological arrangements made to make the thing happen? And what kind of goals do they have? And so that's really had a lot of impact over the years, in part because it was an introduction to citizen science for people in computing and in organizational sciences. And so it gave them a foothold to start working from, because when I got started with my dissertation, there was like literally nothing in my fields on this topic at all. I had to like really scrape to build the lit review and background for that, you know, would stand up to peer review and all of that. So that's kind of how I got to that space. After a few years, I didn't love living in DC. All the amenities and opportunities aside, it was just hard for me on a number of levels. So I moved out to Omaha, where Midwestern living is easy, and I'm at a similarly interdisciplinary college, and it's pretty laid back, and that is just fine with me. I really like it. And so I would be lying if I said that I never considered abandoning research, because it's hard. It's just really hard, right? And I think retrospectively, I kind of go through cycles of questioning the value of my research and kind of the work that I put in, and whether my effort would maybe better be spent on teaching, which I enjoy and am reportedly good at. But that's usually resolved by having some engagement and conversation with colleagues. Under pandemic conditions, it's been a little difficult because the whole like conference culture, that's usually where those conversations happen. And so it's been a little bit of a struggle to figure out like where the value's at, without kind of that community sounding board that I've realized I rely on to really motivate me to keep it moving forward. But I got tenure last year, and so I'm kind of in a space of like thinking differently about what I can do with my work. And so I have a few ideas for some of those kind of like senior scholarly papers, but like things that I want to do for fun, and because I think that they're relevant and important, and not because somebody wants to pay for it, but because I want to work with certain people and we have things to share. And throughout my career, those papers have been kind of the most fun to work on. And it's not like I'm leaving empirical research behind. It's just like, I only have bandwidth to do so many things at a time. I don't have a big lab with a lot of students or anything like that. It's just where I'm at. That's not the model that's going to be successful for me. So I've had to like kind of really reorient my thinking about how you do your work in different kinds of spaces. And that's been a real growth opportunity that I've really been enjoying over the last year.